Drupal, really. Drupal 7 has been out for a few years. I'll talk a little bit about it throughout this and compare it. Drupal 7 is very mature, very stable. It's a great platform to build your applications on, but as with all things on the web, it's time to move on. The web has changed, the world has changed, and Drupal has changed along with it. For those of you who weren't at the server check-in presentation, I am Geerling guy almost everywhere, and I'm also Jeff Geerling in the real world, but you probably won't encounter me there much. I work at Mercy. I'm a senior application developer there. Right now I'm working on Mercy.net, a big Drupal 7 site, and they do a lot of Drupal work, as I mentioned earlier. I also own Midwestern Mac LLC. Under that, I run a couple services like Server Check-in for it's an uptime monitor, and hosted Apache Solar that hosts Apache Solar. That's pretty simple. If you ever have questions or anything, ping me on Twitter, get me on GitHub, Drupal.org, wherever I am. Let me know and I'll help you guys. Let's see. So in this roundtable, I'm just going to discuss Drupal 8 a little bit, give you an overview, show you some of the features, show you some of what's new. A lot of times I've noticed, like a lot of the blog posts and presentations on Drupal 8 seem to be more targeted at, here's this big new cool feature, and here's another big cool feature, and here's another thing. And there's a lot of little islands of information, but I couldn't find a whole lot of overviews of where are we with Drupal 8. Drupal 8's been in development for like 3 or 4 years now. There's a lot that's in it. It's a big change, and it's a big change for the better. So I wanted to try to encapsulate that and show you some of the highlights of Drupal 8, and then also show you where you can find out more about what's going on. So I'm just going to run through 3 main sections: the content management, site building, and development features. And in development, I mean front-end development, back-end development, anything that would involve more of the behind-the-scenes code. And then we'll talk a little bit at the end. You guys can ask questions. We can discuss like where things are going and how we're getting there. So Drupal 8, one of the first questions a lot of people ask, and you find a lot of forum topics that say, so should I start building a site in Drupal 8? It's like, no, not yet. Drupal 8's not actually out yet. Drupal 8's in development. If you wanted to do an experimental site, that'd be fine. But Drupal 8 will probably be released, 8.0, sometime this year. I would say with some amount of confidence, sometime in the summer. But the key word here, and what you'll hear everybody in the Drupal community say, is Drupal 8 will be released when it's ready. So that just means when we get all the critical bugs and problems fixed, which it's interesting, they're critical bugs, but really, as I'll show you in a little bit, Drupal 8 works great right now. But there's bugs being like, some things don't work how they should, but they still work fine. That's a nice thing about Drupal. Since version 7.0, we've had test coverage on almost everything, automated tests. So every patch that goes into Drupal, every new feature is really well tested, and Drupal's a pretty stable platform. Even though we're not even to a beta yet. So anyway, in the Drupal was around 2000 was started up, and then there were a lot of releases up to 5, and at that time they were doing like 4.7.1, 4.7.2. Then around 5.0 they went to 5.0, 5.1, and we've been doing that again. So Drupal 8 will be released sometime this year, and we're probably going to be switching to like 8.0.0 using semantic versioning. So what that's going to enable is, while we're developing Drupal 8, there will be new features added, so Drupal 8 can keep evolving a little quicker than Drupal 7. In 3 years, a lot changes on the web. In the past 3 years, since Drupal 7 to now, really the whole mobile revolution, it was gaining steam in 2010, 2011, but it really picked up, and Drupal 7 was not built for a mobile world. And nowadays, we're seeing more traffic on mobile phones and mobile small tablets and things. So if your application and your website is not built like that, you're going to fall behind. Another question that's asked quite often, especially when you read these blog posts about Symfony and objects and things, is will I have to relearn everything I've ever learned about Drupal? And the answer to that is yes and no. The reason I say that is Drupal's just like the web. Everything is changing. When I started developing websites, it was an HTML file with a couple pictures, and you'd use all these tables and put tables and tables and tables to lay things out. and then you drag a file from your computer up to a server, or you log into the server and edit it in the server. Things have changed radically from then. And if you built a content management system way back then, A, it would be ridiculously complicated back then, and B, there would be no relevance today. One of the cool things about Drupal is every version is radically different, but keeping the same core fundamentals and keeping up with the web. So there are some differences, especially if you're developing Drupal websites, back-end development, and doing some front-end work. There are a lot of little differences and a few big ones. But it's still Drupal. There's still things like blocks and users and nodes and entities. So if you know stuff about Drupal 7, the knowledge remains, but some of the implementation of that knowledge is going to be a lot different. So I'll touch on some of those things, but I'm not going to talk about development much in this presentation. So some things that have changed in content management. This is a little list of the things that I'm going to go over right now. Then I'll give you a short demo. There's a new content form. And you'll notice on here, if you've used Drupal for a long time, it's usually like these huge long forms, like wall of form, basically. In Drupal 8, there's the new form is basically the main fields are on the left, and then there's the vertical tabs now are on the right. So this is like metadata, and then this is the main data for the content. And you can place things either way. So if you have like little checkboxes, you'd put those on the right. If you have big fields and things, you'd put those on the left. And there's some other neat things here that I'll mention throughout the presentation, not going to get too much into it. There's also a lot of improvements for internationalization. Who here has ever had to do multilingual sites? Anything with more than one language? So not too many, but you know that if you have, it's crazy. There's a lot of things involved, a lot of moving parts. For Drupal 7, you usually would enable 3 to 10 modules, and you still wouldn't get anywhere near where you needed to be. With Drupal 8, one of the big initiatives, especially since Drupal is used in like 180, 200 something countries, and is used by a lot of non-English native people, everything is now in core. Everything in Drupal 7, and then more features, is in core way better than it ever was in Drupal 7. I'm not going to give a demonstration of it today because it would take a little bit of extra time to try to show that all. Don't have time for that, but there's some sessions online you can read and view the slides from Drupal cons and Drupal camps about all this stuff. It's cool. If you ever have to do multilingual, it's not easy. It's always hard to do that kind of stuff, but it's way easier with Drupal than I've ever seen with any other system. With Drupal 8. There's a lot of little accessibility improvements and some big ones, like there's this Drupal announce JavaScript functionality. You can have your page react, like if you use Ajax to refresh an element on the page, you can have it announce things through screen readers to people while it's doing things. That's a pretty big win there because and it's built into Drupal's core framework, so it's easy to use. Modules can use it. And Drupal has always been very accessible, scoring higher in the ARIA testing and accessibility suites and things. All the core themes, all the core modules are well tested, and Drupal is used on so many sites, like government sites, where accessibility is a requirement, and you can be guaranteed that almost anything you do in Drupal by default will be accessible. But Drupal 8 has some neat little improvements there. And one final cool feature that if you've ever had to do documentation for a website, or if you ever had to do training, Tours lets you set up for your own modules or for any kind of interface on the site these little widgets. You might have seen them on some sites. Like Apple uses them a lot on like iTunes, and a lot of iPhone apps use them, where you basically get guided through the interface with these little pop-ups over which elements do what things. And to somebody new to views, there was a session on views earlier, and if you're new to it, it can be very complicated. This is so helpful just to give you an overview of, like, here's where the title is for the view, here's where you manage the displays, and what is a display. Instead of just showing you a wall of text, it guides you through the page. So I'll give you a quick demo of this on a site on here. Let me bring this monitor over here so I can actually see. This site is running on my local computer. This is Drupal 8 core as of a couple days ago, I think yesterday. And So first of all, I'll show you the content form. So on this content form, you have, it's a basic content form that you'd normally see in Drupal 7, but this area over here, it makes it more compact. You don't have to scroll down hundreds of pages to see stuff anymore. And you'll notice there's a built-in WYSIWYG editor. This is CK Editor, and CK Editor the Drupal project and CK Editor kind of work together to make it so well integrated that it's like you can't break things as much. One of the hard things in WYSIWYG in general is how do you make it so that it looks like it's going to look on the final website and make it still work with all the code in the back end and everything. And Drupal 8 has helped CK Editor become more accessible, more integrated, and still, like when you insert pictures with captions, the data tags and things are all the right way so that you can still parse it out and do the right things with it. And even when you add an image in CK Editor, it adds it as a field to the node. So that's one thing that, sometimes you'd have an image field. You'd add the image, then you'd insert it into the WYSIWYG. Then you delete the image on the thing, and then it goes out of your WYSIWYG, but it's still in there because you inserted it. This tracks that kind of stuff. It's really awesome. So another thing that's everywhere in Drupal 8 is in-place editing, and that's also enabled by CK Editor's improvements. If I say quick edit, then now I can just change things in here, like delete, save, and there it is. So that is everywhere. Blocks, fields, like individual date fields, you can edit them in place. Like you don't have to hack craziness to try to get this stuff done. In Drupal 7, there were some ways to do it, but A, a lot of them were buggy, and B, a lot of them were slow, and C, it was always just kind of clunky, the interface. Drupal 8 has it built in for everything. Let's see, and then finally I'll show you a tour. Actually, I'll show you this toolbar too. In Drupal 8, this toolbar is fully responsive and flexible and shows everything that you need to see. The shortcuts are actually more useful now because it's easier to add them and arrange them in here. I can shoot this over to the left side if I want, or back up to the top. And if I resize my screen, get out of here. Why did that even pop up? Turn hiding. Okay, so here we go. So if I move over, notice the toolbar pops over to the left side because it doesn't fit across the top. And I'll get into that a little more, the responsiveness, later. But you'll notice that everything is flowing around, and Drupal 8, front end and back end, everything is responsive and designed really well. But I'll show you one of those tours under structure, views. And I'll get into views in a minute too. So if you see a little tour thing up here, you click it, and it just guides you through, like, here's the displays, and this is what the active display is. Here's how to administer this view. It just steps you through. It's so much more intuitive than in the old days. What you'd do is you'd click help, and you get shot over here, and you're like, oh, what the, and you're like views UI, and you're like, I have no idea. Like, you go over here, and then you're completely away from where you were. Tours is in the page with you, guiding you. So
every new user will get that tour.
Yeah.
And you can use tours for your own module, right?
Yeah, tours are easy to write, and I'll talk about that a little bit later too, with the developer section. It's so easy. With YAML, you just basically have a list of things targeted at certain elements on the page, and that's it. So let me get back into here, and we'll get into site building. So that was like content management, a lot of the content editors and people adding news posts and things and managing the content. For site building, the biggest thing by far, I would say, in Drupal 6, fields came into core, and that was amazing. Or in Drupal 7, sorry, fields came into core. They were so popular, like you could add fields to your content and add image fields and file fields, and it's like, why isn't this part of core? And then in Drupal 7 it was. And Drupal 8, views are in core. So now you can add your content, arrange your content how you want, and then in views you can display it however you want. You can output RSS feeds, you can output CSVs, XML, everything, just clicking a couple buttons. A lot of people come over from some other planet into the Drupal realm, and they don't really see what's interesting about Drupal. It's like you're just clicking on stuff and editing it, it's like everything does that. But then when you see views and you see how you can build an entire application, like earlier I was showing server check-in, that's just a few checkboxes and a couple fields and you're done. Like I built server check-in in a day or so using all Drupal's core stuff. And there was part of it that didn't scale well, so I just took that out. But Views is in core now, and it's going to make Drupal that much better because Views is going to be more stable. It's already released for Drupal 8, and it already is better than the Drupal 7 version. Also, we moved a ton of fields in core. Let me pop over here. So you saw Views a second ago. All these fields are now in core. I think on every site I've built in the past 5 years, I have had every one of those except for telephone sometimes. All those fields I've had to download and install or have them in my install profile. They're all built into core now. So date field, it's like there was no core, there was no way to add a date in core. Now there is. You'd have to download the date module. Telephone's built in. It supports telephones for any country in the world.
So date is a complete replacement for the date times?
Date time is date module, but really awesome in Drupal core.
Does it do calendaring? Or?
No. The calendar will still be a separate thing. But it lets you add dates to content, basically, and display them in different ways. And I'll show you a couple of those when we get to the demo part. Also, as I was showing you on there, when you resize the screen, things respond. It's responsive, mobile first. There was a whole team of people working on getting everything in Drupal mobile friendly, including the admin interfaces. A lot of times, you'll see people build websites responsive and mobile, but they don't do anything for the back end. Everything is front end, so when your administrators come up, it's like, oh, I'm on my iPhone, I can't do that. I can't edit this page, I can't change that block. Well, in Drupal 8, you can. Every form, every admin form, every back-end area is fully responsive and able to be used on iPads and iPhones and Android phones and even Windows phones, everything. And the thing that this also gives us is no matter where you are or what your device you're on, it's going to work. Like with Drupal 7, there was times when it's like, I don't want to manage that, Everything works mobile and the touch works correctly because, as I said, Drupal is working with CK Editor and all these other projects to make sure that touch works right too. And that's important because in today's world, like on some of my sites, over 50% of the users are coming on literal mobile devices, not just tablets, but iPhones, Galaxies, smartphones. So I would say if your site doesn't work fully on a mobile phone in the year 2015, then you're going to start losing traffic because of that. You're going to lose visitors. And then we also have the form display UI for anybody that's ever had to add hook form alter to every single module and every single site they've ever built, like me. This is a godsend. You've always been able to edit the display. So you'd add a bunch of fields, and you could maybe change the order of them or something. You'd add all these fields, but you wanted one that you wanted to show on the site, but you didn't want to show on the admin form. It's like a field that gets filled in automatically or something like that. Well, now you can manage your form display separately from your actual display and separately from the field management. So if you wanted to have an email field or a date field that was auto-populated after somebody saves a node and not actually show it on the node form, you don't have to do a hook form alter and say, if this, then hide the form or whatever. Now you can manage the form display and say, I just want to hide that date field. Or I want to change the way the link field looks in the management side just for the admin form. So that's really powerful and neat. Blocks are actually useful, finally. I think half or more of the sites that I've worked on uses a combination of context, beans, panels, panelizer, and 20 other modules that do stuff that's kind of like blocks, but not quite, hacks blocks and does crazy things. Blocks are basically just pieces of content or data that you put in different places on the site. And what can be really powerful is when you can take things and put them in different places based on different things. And in Drupal 8, this is finally possible in core. And one of the coolest things, it's a very simple thing, you can create a custom block and have it in more than one place. Your mind is blown, isn't it? In Drupal 7 and below, that was not possible. Now, another thing that's amazing and cool is, like everything else in Drupal 8, blocks are entities with fields. So you can make a block that's like a content type where you have an image field and a whatever field, and you can create 100 of those kind of blocks with different things and have them placed in different places. It's going to be powerful, and especially if we can make it so that like the Bean module developers and the context module developers, if they can focus less on this interface part that they've all had to implement differently and more on making things work together better and do really cool things, then blocks are actually going to be useful in Drupal again. So anyway, blocks are cool. Also, Drupal 8 has RESTful web services built in. So everything in Drupal, which, as I said, everything is an entity now, everything can be exposed through a REST interface, create, editing, deleting, and listing and everything, and Views works with this and everything. So if you need to integrate Drupal with an app, or if you need to integrate Drupal with pretty much anything in the world, you can expose HAL and JSON and XML, and you can consume that, and you can do anything you want with it now. This is built in. And right now, Drupal core just has basic authentication, which is not very secure because you're passing credentials in the URL, that kind of thing. But there are plugins being written for OAuth and for other kinds of authentication. And HAL is like a JSON-based hypertext application language or something like that. It's a way of expressing relationships between pieces of content using JSON. And it will be helpful to advance the state of integrating things with Drupal, where you have multiple entities relating to each other, and you want to download one and get the other information. Anyways, and I'm not going to be able to demo that today because there's actually a bug with the way that entities are displayed right now. So as I said, Drupal's works great. It's just there's a couple things, So I'll demo a couple of those things really quick here. Oh, it's over here. All right, so we have views I showed you, but I'll pop in here. Another cool thing about views is that all of the core content listings in the past, there's no way to override things like the front page view. You'd have to basically rewrite your whole front page. Now a front page is a view. If I wanted to change it to a listing with 2 blocks and a thing and a whatever in views, you can just edit this and change that kind of stuff right in the interface. And also, like another thing I hated was I always wanted under the people thing just to have a field that said username is Geerling Guy, and then I could find myself. When you have 50,000 users, it's annoying to have to scroll through a list or know the user ID to get to the user. In Drupal 8, this is a view, and this is just a filter. So you can search on a name or search on a field in the user profile. In all the other Drupal sites, I'd have to create a view to override the core listing. In Drupal 8, it's a view, so it's easy to do. So we also have fields. And I just wanted to show you some of these different fields. So these are all the fields we have now in Drupal 8 built in. There's an email field that validates if it's a valid email address. It has formatting options, date. It has a pop-up built in, just like the normal date field. And I guess, and you can, everything is built with HTML5 and all the latest jQuery UI goodness. So, you can, if you change the date, you can go back to the default, and you can use the up and down and choose the date. Link, it's pretty basic, a URL and a link, the text that will display. Telephone, it can validate different regions and things. And then entity reference. And you'll notice here I have referenced Drupal Camp St. Louis. And if I go over to content, there's no node called Drupal Camp St. Louis, so what am I referencing here? And some people would say that's a good question. I am actually referencing, why can I not scroll here? I'm actually referencing a block from a node. And if you have not, if you've done a lot of Drupal work and you've used entity reference before, this will blow your mind that you can literally reference anything on the site, users, blocks, files, anything from any kind of reference. So if you have a block, you can reference a user in that block and have their profile information displayed. If you have a node, you can reference 3 blocks and have the blocks displayed inside that node. You could do this stuff in Drupal 7, but you'd need like 12 modules to do these things. In Drupal 8, it's all built in, and you can. It's amazing to be able to link data together that easily, all within Drupal core. So if I go back here, so that's the default display of all these different things, I'm sure and this is that block reference. It's literally displaying the content of that block inside the node, and that's built into core. In Drupal 7, you'd have to have a few modules to do that. So let me pop back over to the presentation. And for this stuff, I won't have a demo because otherwise I'd just be sitting up here coding something. But there's tons. This is like scratching the surface of the tip of an iceberg in terms of what's new for developers. And a lot of people, there's been some complaints sometimes about how complicated Drupal 8 is and all that, but really it hasn't changed a whole lot conceptually. Things are the same conceptually. What's changed is some of the syntax and some of the ways we do things. But anyway, I'll go through some of those. First of all, Drupal now uses Symfony as a base. Drupal, as with many PHP projects in the past and in the present, used to basically have all its own code to do all its own things. So like menu routing and form validation and display of stuff and template rendering. Everything was custom. Everything was written by Drupal. Everything was maintained by Drupal. And that afforded some nice things. There were some great things about that architecture, especially back in PHP 4 days and even early PHP 5 days when Drupal was one of the big systems. But nowadays, so many people have standardized on certain components, and like Symfony provides some very robust, simple, well-architected components like a menu router and a form validator and things like that. And Symfony has adopted some of those things. And I'm not going to go into detail on them, but there's a couple great presentations. One of them is by Larry Garfield Krell from Palantir, same company as Brad. So I encourage you to go check those out if you're a developer. He'll talk about some of the whys and some of the hows too. And I want to highlight the routing system a little bit. For any developer that's been working in Drupal 6 and 7 and 5, 4 was a little different. Hook menu is basically like one of the hooks that you touch on a daily basis. And in Drupal 8, instead of doing hook menu, it's just the YAML file. You say, here's the route, the path for the route, and then this is, in this instance, it's calling a form, which is that honeypot settings controller. And the way this works is standard across Symfony and Drupal and a lot of other applications out there and frameworks. And it's using YAML. So a couple cool things here. YAML is an industry standard way of describing objects and content and things like that. So we're using YAML, which is a standard. This routing method is standard across, like a lot of Java projects have the same kind of thing. You define a route, you give it a path, you give it a controller, that kind of stuff. Hook menu was similar in concept, but the syntax was crazy, and it was just huge arrays of menu items. And a lot of people would call it the array of doom. And this kind of gets us back into, this is what the rest of the world is doing. You give a route, like honeypot config for configuration, and you tell it where it is, and you tell it how to get it. And then in Drupal, it also has permissions. So if you have that permission, you can get to that path. So again, there's a lot more about this, all these different topics elsewhere. I'm just giving you a scratch at the surface. Configuration management, huge improvement. For anybody that's had to use features, I say had to use because until probably the past year, features was an exercise in frustration many times. The problem with features is modules had to explicitly define configuration and things. And so you had like configuration in the database, configuration to be exported, all this craziness going on. In Drupal 8, every piece of configuration is managed by Drupal's configuration management system. So you can literally click export on this full import-export tab, and your entire site configuration will be dumped into a zip file of a bunch of YAML. And the other cool thing that enables is YAML is easy to read. As you could see back here, it's just a list of stuff, basically. And then you take that, and you take it from your test server or your staging server, and just drag it over to prod. Commit it in Git, push it up, you're done. That's a deployment. I could go into more detail on this, but again, there's tons of great presentations out there. Features in the future, I think, will be more of an interface to this rather than what it is right now is a huge conglomeration of different things that mostly work but sometimes kill you. Going along with the theme of using the best things that for the purpose, Drupal in the past has had, for JavaScript, maybe 20% of external libraries and 80% internal code that Drupal had to maintain and keep up to date and all that. Drupal has pulled in a lot of good components from the PHP and JavaScript world, like Symfony, I said. We're using Composer to pull in dependencies now, so it's easier to deploy Drupal. You can just put it on something, add to your Composer JSON file, and then it'll download all the stuff you need for your site. Doctrine, EasyRDF, I'm not going to go through all these. A couple other ones like Twig is in there, and I think I might mention Twig again later, but Twig is the new way of doing templates, which is, Twig is similar in syntax to what you'd find in Python and in some Java templating languages, and it's designer-oriented. A lot of times in Drupal, things are more PHP developer-oriented, like PHP template, the system we use in Drupal 7. So in Drupal 8, it'll be easier for designers to pop in there. They don't have to figure out all the crazy PHP syntax. And everything is tested in PHP unit, which is much faster and much more, it helps you with making sure your architecture is better for testing too. And Drupal has grown quite a bit there. And as I said earlier, CK editor is now used and was improved quite a bit for Drupal 8. One of the things that earlier we were talking a little bit about migrating content going from Drupal 6 to 7, 7 to 8. So there are two big goals that Dries and everyone else in the Drupal community has had for Drupal 8. We want to get people that are still on Drupal 6, which is now, 7 years old? Or I don't know, 7 or 8 years old. We're going to get those people into Drupal 8 because Drupal 6 is going to be unsupported soon, which means security releases, security fixes won't be happening within the next year or two. And we want to get people on Drupal 7 up to Drupal 8, but we don't want to make it hard. Drupal 6 to 7 was very hard, as anybody that's done one of those migrations can say. So migrate module is now in core, and the way it's being developed is so if you use like all the core things and CCK fields in Drupal 6 and all that kind of stuff, that'll all be migrated directly into Drupal 8 without you doing any work at all. There might be some custom stuff that you have to move, and some modules, some older modules might not get their data migrated, so either you'll have to find a new module and migrate the data yourself, or you just have to give it up. But that one, that support for Drupal 6 to 8 was just committed, and will be in the next Drupal alpha release. So you can start testing that, see what works and what doesn't work. And then Drupal 7 to 8 is in progress, and it promises to be a lot easier even than the 6 to 7 process. There was a module called Migrate D2D. Joel was mentioning that earlier, I think. And it helps you basically say, like, I have all these content types in 6, and I have all these in 7, and push them all over. And it makes that process relatively painless. With 6 and 7 to 8, with Migrate, it's going to be like that, but built into core and well-tested. I have a lot of confidence that I'll be moving some of my sites to 8 a lot sooner than I did 6 to 7. And finally, for the developers, you will probably rejoice and scream and cheer when you see this. I don't know how many thousands of times I've written something like this, or used like enemy metadata wrapper, or used some of these crazy functions just to pull information out of a node. I have a node, I want to get the value of a field. In Drupal 8, you just do node, field, value. Done. Another one. We have hook block info, hook block configure, hook block save, hook block view, hook block, So this is a pattern that was in PHP 4. This was actually really nice. Like in PHP 4, you could describe information about something and define it and tell it what to do with it and all that through some functional procedural methods like this. But the world has moved on. And in Drupal 8 now, all of this is in one file that implements block plugin interface. You describe your block, you tell it what it does, you can give it a configure form, all in one file, in one configuration. Cool thing that enables is if you want to have a new block, you just duplicate the plugin file and change the title and the whatever, and you're done. That's your new block. Drupal picks that up automatically without having to implement tons of hooks and do tons of switch statements. And finally, if you ever have to deal with caching, you know that it can be one of the most confusing parts of Drupal because there's like 17 caching systems, and one for blocks, and one for nodes, and one for whatever. In Drupal 8, there's Drupal cache, and it handles all the different caches. and the interfaces for caching is a lot easier. So those are just 3. There's literally hundreds more things like this where if you've ever been bewildered by the landscape of Drupal craziness, you will be pleased with Drupal 8, I think. There's a ton more things. These are just some notes that I had that I was thinking about including, but I'm like, there's no way I can talk about all this and still have time to talk to everybody afterwards. But like, there's some cool things like, which one was it? The entity reference to any entity. If you think about the implications of that, where you can just throw blocks into nodes and throw users into blocks and do whatever you want, put a view into something. You don't have to like configure tons of stuff to make a page that's ridiculously complicated but simple. My mind was blown when I saw that. I was thinking that entity reference was just the same thing as Drupal 7 but in core, but it's completely different because Drupal 8 is architected better. There's responsive images built into Drupal 8 core, so it's easy to, one of the hardest things when I'm doing my front-end work is finding a way to make the images respond to the size and do the 2 times for different devices and stuff. There's a library built into core to help with that. The fact that it's mobile first is great. It's like, some other systems that make it harder to do that. I don't think you're going to lose relevance if you're not mobile first in the next couple of years, because more and more people, especially like here in the US, there's a lot of people still using laptops and tablets and desktops, but especially in other countries, there's a lot of populations where there's a lot more people using mobile devices than desktop computers. So if your site is terrible on a mobile device, why would people want to go to it? So anyway, there's so much more. There's no way I can cover it. I could go on for 3 or 4 hours and still be talking. I almost wanted to spend 30 minutes on each one of those slides. But I just want to talk, and you guys can ask questions. We can talk. Don't have to talk all about Drupal 8 too. Talk to us about Drupal development,